I didn't just let my husband cheat. I encouraged it. While he thought he was fooling me, I was flipping his betrayal into cold, hard cash. Every affair, every secret, every dirty little lie. I made him pay for it, without him even realizing it. And the day he thought he'd finally upgrade to his mistress, I smiled, because the mansion, the business, the bank accounts were already mine. He lost his wife, he lost his lover, and he lost his entire life without a single warning. You want to know how? If you've ever been lied to, if you've ever felt used, stay right here. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about revenge done right. I'll show you exactly how I turned heartbreak into complete domination. My name is Laura Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and I wasn't born into privilege, but I built every piece of it with my bare hands. Growing up in a tiny town in Missouri, I knew one thing: I was never going to be the woman who settled. I watched my mother cry in the kitchen after working double shifts, while my father disappeared for days on end. I swore I'd never be trapped in that same cycle. I wanted more comfort, more control, more life. And I thought I'd found it when I met Greg. Greg wasn't some small-town loser. He was charming, ambitious, with the kind of smile that could melt steel. Back then, I was a broke college student working 2 jobs, while Greg was the up-and-coming star at a tech startup. He wined me, dined me, made me feel like I was finally stepping into the life I deserved. He promised stability, love, a future far from the struggles I'd known. At 25, I married him. At 27, I started my own interior design business, small projects at first, decorating friends' apartments, then bigger contracts as my name started circulating in the city. By 30, Greg's company took off, and we were making 6 figures. Then 7. Life looked perfect from the outside. Beautiful house in the suburbs, luxury cars in the driveway, dreamy Instagram vacations. But behind the curated photos and the polite dinner parties, cracks were forming. Greg loved to brag about being a provider, but truthfully, he had always been reckless with money. He'd spend thousands on sports cars and spontaneous trips with the boys. I overlooked it at first. Who was I to ruin his fun? After all, I wasn't the nagging wife. I was the cool, independent woman who had her own thriving career. But then I noticed the late-night texts, the work trips that didn't make sense, the smell of expensive perfume on shirts I hadn't worn. I confronted him once, just once, and he laughed it off, called me paranoid. He turned it around on me, accused me of being insecure and controlling. That was my turning point. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to play smarter. So while Greg kept living his double life, I quietly built my empire. I invested every extra dollar into my business. I read every book on financial independence, took every course on passive income. I made sure every new property we bought was listed solely under my name. I was patient, disciplined, and most importantly, silent. I played the perfect wife, smiled at parties, posted cute couple photos, laughed at his jokes in public. But every smile hid another business deal, every laugh covered up another layer of protection I built for myself. By the time I turned 34, I didn't need Greg anymore. I had 6 rental properties bringing in passive income, 2 high-ticket design clients who kept me booked year-round, and more money flowing into my personal accounts than Greg even realized existed. He thought he was winning. He had no idea he was just funding my escape plan. And when the final piece fell into place, when the day came that Greg thought he'd finally upgrade to the younger woman he'd been secretly dating, he didn't realize he was walking straight into my trap. But we'll get to that. Our day-to-day life looked picture-perfect from the outside, and I made sure to keep it that way. Every morning started the same. Greg would leave early, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, always claiming he had an early meeting downtown. I'd kiss him goodbye at the door, handing him his travel coffee cup, smile plastered on my face like a perfect housewife, even though inside, I had stopped believing a word he said. I'd return to my home office, not to scroll through social media, but to run my growing design company like a machine. My mornings were filled with client consultations, vendor meetings, property visits. I learned how to make my time work for me, squeezing productivity into every available hour. By lunch, I'd have already closed a new client, secured a rental deal, or launched a fresh marketing campaign. By the time Greg got home, sometimes 7, sometimes 10, dinner would be served, the house would be spotless, and I would be unbothered. I made sure to never ask too many questions. I made sure to always support his career, because the more he thought I was clueless, the more careless he became. My routine was predictable, efficient, calculated. But my evenings, those were sacred. That was my time to reconnect with myself, to fuel my growth. While Greg was working late, I was learning business podcasts, online investing classes, networking events. I absorbed every trick, every strategy on how to turn money into freedom. There were nights I'd sit by the pool with my laptop, soft jazz playing in the background, sipping on red wine while transferring funds between investment accounts. I wasn't just a business owner anymore, I was building a financial fortress. And the irony? Greg thought I was home pining for him, waiting for his scraps of attention. The more detached I became from him emotionally, the more obsessed I grew with securing my independence. But I never let it show. I knew better than to tip my hand too early. It was around our 8th anniversary when the first real mistake happened. Greg came home from a supposed business trip in Miami, looking a little too refreshed. His tan was a bit too even, his smile a bit too smug. And when I went to unpack his suitcase, something I hadn't done in years, I found a hotel receipt from a 5-star resort in Key West. Not Miami, Key West. I didn't confront him, not immediately. I simply smiled, folded his clothes, and mentally noted the date. A few weeks later, I noticed something else. His work dinners became more frequent. He'd suddenly have back-to-back meetings that conveniently stretched through weekends. And then there were the charges, luxury dinners at restaurants we never visited together, spa services, designer boutiques that didn't cater to men. The final straw was the hotel keycard he carelessly left in his coat pocket. A hotel I knew all too well because I had just helped one of my clients design their penthouse suite there. I didn't need to ask questions anymore. I didn't need him to lie to my face. I had all the answers I needed. But instead of falling apart, I smiled wider. Instead of confronting, I calculated deeper. Because I realized something in those quiet, painful moments. Every time Greg cheated, it gave me more freedom. Every time he lied, it bought me more time to expand my empire. His betrayal became my greatest motivator. So, I doubled down on my business. I closed on 2 more properties that year, invested in a boutique design firm, and quietly moved assets into a trust that had my name, and only my name. Greg had no idea the empire he thought was ours was rapidly becoming mine. He thought I was too busy playing housewife. But the truth? I was too busy preparing for his downfall. And when I finally decided it was time to make my move, Greg never saw it coming. But we're not there yet. First, you need to hear how far his betrayal actually went. The beginning of the end started with a single text message, one Greg wasn't careful enough to hide. It was a Thursday evening, and Greg was, once again, working late. I had just finished reviewing the design proposal for a high-profile real estate project when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, Greg was meticulous about keeping his phone glued to his hand, but that night, he slipped. I didn't go looking. I didn't snoop. It blinked right there in front of me. Can't wait for this weekend, baby. Hope your wife buys the Miami story again. I didn't feel my heart drop. I didn't cry. I laughed. Because now, it was no longer suspicion, it was confirmation. I placed his phone right back where it was and made myself a cup of tea. My time was coming. From that point, Greg's sloppiness became impossible to ignore. He had grown overconfident, assuming I was completely under his spell. His business trips increased to nearly every other weekend. Sometimes, he wouldn't even bother with excuses, just throwing around vague terms like networking retreat or investor meeting. The man couldn't lie to save his life, but he sure knew how to spend money like it was nothing. I monitored everything, every credit card statement, every mysterious wire transfer, every unusual ATM withdrawal. He didn't know it, but I had full access to our joint accounts. I saw every dinner, every hotel booking, every impulsive shopping spree at jewelry boutiques that I'd never stepped foot in. And it wasn't just one woman. Oh no, there were multiple. A rotation. A revolving door of temporary affairs that Greg cycled through like a midlife crisis on steroids. One evening, while reviewing a vendor contract, I stumbled across a hotel reservation under Greg's name. Except this time, it wasn't even out of town. It was 20 minutes away. He was literally lying to my face and sleeping with another woman in the next zip code. That night, as I waited for him to come home at midnight smelling of cheap cologne and bad decisions, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It wasn't about him being unfaithful. This was war. And I wasn't going to be the fool who sat back and watched him destroy everything I had built. The next morning, I called my attorney. No, I didn't file for divorce. That would be too easy, too obvious. I wanted leverage, power, control. So, I started preparing. Quietly, methodically. I rewrote my business contracts, making sure Greg had zero legal claim to my growing portfolio. I transferred our joint savings into accounts solely in my name, using legitimate business expenses as the reason. I had my name taken off any shared liability and moved all high-value assets, paintings, luxury watches, vintage jewelry, into a secure storage unit only I had access to. Then came the properties. Greg was too busy playing Casanova to realize I was buying him out of every shared investment we owned. I refinanced, leveraged, and negotiated until every deed had my signature, and only my signature, on it. But I didn't stop there. I hired a private investigator. If Greg wanted to play dirty, I would play smarter. Within 2 weeks, I had photos, videos, and detailed reports of every affair, every girlfriend, every romantic getaway funded by my hard work. I had enough ammunition to burn his reputation to the ground. And the best part? Greg had no clue. At home, I was the same doting wife, smiling, cooking, laughing. I still kissed him goodbye, still sat beside him at dinner parties, still posted cute couple goals pictures on social media. But every picture hid a secret. Every smile masked a strategy. He thought I was too stupid to catch on. In reality, I was building a financial noose around his neck, tightening it a little more each day. And just when Greg thought life couldn't get better, I was preparing to show him just how bad it could get. But first, I needed to wait for him to make one final, fatal mistake. And trust me, he did not disappoint. Greg always thought he was the smartest man in the room. And honestly, that worked in my favor, because the more arrogant he became, the sloppier his mistakes got. After hiring the private investigator, the floodgates opened. Within the first week, I had confirmation of 3 different women, all in rotation. The investigator, Mark, a former detective, was thorough. He didn't just give me pictures. He handed me detailed timelines, license plate records, hotel security footage, even dinner receipts. The funniest part? Greg wasn't even original in his betrayals. He took all of them to the same overpriced seafood restaurant, stayed at the same boutique hotel, even bought them identical bracelets from the same jewelry store downtown. It was almost insulting how little effort he put into his lies. But I didn't just stop at catching him in the act. I wanted to know where every dollar was going. I hired a forensic accountant. Yes, I went full throttle. Jessica, my accountant, was a quiet genius with a knack for finding hidden accounts. Within 2 weeks, she uncovered an entire web of secret expenses Greg had tried to hide under fake business invoices. Fake consulting fees, cash withdrawals labeled as vendor payments, and worst of all, money funneled into a private investment account Greg thought was untraceable. Except it wasn't. I had everything I needed, but I wanted more. I wasn't going to just punish Greg. I was going to destroy the very foundation he built his ego on. So I dug deeper. Through casual conversation, I manipulated Greg into admitting things without realizing it. At one dinner, I asked, "Babe, how's the new investor group you mentioned last week?" His eyes lit up, because men like Greg couldn't resist bragging about their schemes. "Oh, it's great, Laura. Super exclusive circle, big returns, way better than that boring real estate stuff you do." I smiled, nodded, acted impressed, all the while memorizing every name he dropped. A few calls later, I discovered the truth. Greg wasn't part of any elite investment group. He was being scammed by a flashy con artist who preyed on arrogant middle-aged men with too much cash and too little sense. The irony was delicious. Greg was stealing from me, and someone else was stealing from him. That's when I knew it was time to prepare the final play. I called my lawyer again. We drew up 2 versions of divorce papers, one clean, the other loaded with the evidence I had gathered. One version offered Greg a quiet, discreet separation where he'd walk away with a fraction of what he thought he owned. The other was nuclear, designed to publicly humiliate him, cost him his job, his reputation, and leave him bankrupt. But I wasn't ready to deliver them. Yet. I needed to see how far Greg would take this delusion. So, I set a trap. I told Greg I'd be out of town for a women's business retreat for 3 days. In reality, I was watching him from across the street. I rented an Airbnb next door to the hotel Greg checked into, 2 blocks from our house. Mark sent me live updates. Greg wasn't just seeing one mistress. He was entertaining 2 women at the same time. Same weekend. Same hotel. The audacity was laughable. Then came the final piece. The security footage of Greg walking out of the hotel, arms around both women, grinning like a teenager who thought he had won the lottery. Except the only person winning was me. By Sunday evening, I had enough documentation to bury Greg under a mountain of betrayal, financial fraud, and marital misconduct. My portfolio of evidence was bulletproof: photos, timestamps, transaction records, video surveillance, audio clips from phone taps where Greg blatantly lied about his whereabouts. And while I was putting the finishing touches on my legal strategy, Greg was busy planning his fresh start with his latest conquest. Little did he know, his fresh start was going to begin with absolute nothingness. Because I wasn't just going to leave him, I was going to strip him of every illusion of power he ever thought he had. The stage was set, the clock was ticking, and Greg's downfall was about to go public. The day I confronted Greg wasn't dramatic, at least, not for me. It was calm, strategic, and executed with precision. It was a Sunday afternoon, sunny and peaceful. Exactly the kind of day Greg thought he'd spend lounging on our deck, pretending to be the perfect suburban husband. He walked through the door, sunglasses on, smelling of expensive aftershave that wasn't from me, holding his phone, texting, probably lining up his next affair. "Hey, babe," he greeted, not even looking up. I smiled. "We need to talk." That was the first time in years I saw his smile fade immediately. Greg wasn't used to me initiating confrontation. He was used to passive smiles and fake forgiveness. I slid a thick folder across the kitchen island, perfectly labeled: legal evidence, financial fraud, infidelity, marital misconduct. Greg blinked, confused. What? What is this?" I stayed quiet, watching his fingers tremble as he flipped through the pages. Pictures of him with his mistresses, timestamps from hotel surveillance, screenshots of bank transfers, audio transcripts of his phone calls, and, the crown jewel, proof of his exclusive investment group being a scam that had already drained over $120,000 from his private account. His breathing grew heavier, his skin paled. You've been spying on me? Oh no, Greg, I said sweetly. I've been protecting myself, while you were busy embarrassing yourself. He slammed the folder shut, trying to regain his usual arrogance. You can't use this against me. Everything we have is joint property. Half of it is mine. That's when I placed the second folder down, quietly, deliberately. Correction. Everything we had was joint property. I made sure to change that. I opened the folder for him page by page, the business ownership transfer agreements, the refinanced property deeds in my name, the dissolution of joint accounts, every transaction accounted for legally. The ironclad prenuptial addendum he had signed after refinancing the house, cleverly disguised as a tax efficiency update. Greg's jaw clenched so hard I thought it might break. You can't do this. This is illegal. I leaned forward, cold and composed. Actually, it's very legal. And you were too busy chasing women to notice your name disappearing from every asset you once bragged about. He stood, knocking over the bar stool. I'll fight this. I'll take it all back. My lawyer. I cut him off, sliding my phone across the counter. Already spoken to your lawyer. Turns out, conflict of interest means you'll need a new one. Mine is better, by the way. A lot better. I let that sit for a moment before delivering the final blow. Option 1. You walk away quietly, sign the divorce papers, leave with enough to keep yourself afloat for a while, and I keep this quiet. Option 2. I go public, with the affairs, the financial fraud, the corporate violations you thought I didn't know about. I destroy your reputation, your career, and what little self-respect you have left. Greg stared at me, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, frozen in shock. For the first time in our entire marriage, he had nothing to say. I continued, my voice steady. And just so you're clear, even your latest girlfriend is in the evidence packet. She's been sending me screenshots of your conversations for weeks. Turns out, she prefers cash over you. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in years. You have 48 hours to sign everything. Otherwise, the first person who gets these files is your boss. Greg collapsed into the kitchen chair, head in his hands, breathing shallow. It was the sound of a man who realized everything he built wasn't his. And it never was. I grabbed my bag, paused at the door, and looked back at the shell of a man I once thought was my future. You thought you were playing me, Greg, but you were funding me. And with that, I walked out, calm, victorious, free. He stayed behind, trapped in the ruins of his own making. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was quiet, surgical, and devastating. Greg signed the papers within 24 hours. At first, he tried to put on a brave face, pretending he didn't care, mumbling something about starting over and this won't break me. But within weeks, the reality of what he'd lost came crashing down like a tidal wave. He didn't just lose his wife, he lost his home, because I legally owned the property and sold it within 2 weeks of the divorce. The new owners didn't care for Greg's sob story. They cared about their fresh remodel and clean title. He didn't just lose his house, he lost his car. The flashy sports car he used to pick up his mistresses? Gone. Repossessed after I closed the joint line of credit he was defaulting on. He had to downgrade to a 10-year-old sedan just to get around. His precious investment account that was supposed to fund his new life? Empty. The scammer cleaned him out completely, and there was no legal recourse. He didn't even have the money to hire a decent lawyer to fight back. Worse yet, the world he thought adored him turned on him fast. His boss got wind of his side activities from an anonymous tip. He was fired within a month for violating company ethics. Turns out, corporate America doesn't have much patience for executives who fund personal affairs through business accounts. His so-called friends? Gone. The men he bragged to at the golf club distanced themselves the moment they realized Greg wasn't the high roller they thought. Turns out, in their circles, respect is directly tied to wealth. And Greg no longer had any. And the younger women he thought would be his fresh start? They left faster than they came. Mistresses who enjoyed expensive dinners and luxury weekends vanished the second the money dried up. The last text I heard he received was, "Call me when you're interesting again." For Greg, the fall wasn't just financial, it was personal. The man who once strutted around acting invincible now rented a dingy one-bedroom apartment downtown. I knew because Mark, my private investigator, continued sending me updates just to close the loop. Meanwhile, my life didn't just recover, it flourished. I expanded my design business into 2 more cities, signed a national retail contract, and diversified my investments into commercial real estate. I took those months after the divorce to travel across Europe, learned new languages, made new business connections, and rebuilt my life exactly how I wanted, without lies, without manipulation, and without Greg weighing me down. People whispered, of course, they always do. Some wondered why I gave up on my marriage. But I didn't give up. I evolved. I adapted. I outplayed the man who thought I'd always be one step behind. The best revenge wasn't just taking Greg's money. It was proving to myself that I never needed him in the first place. And Greg? He was left with nothing except the bitter realization that his downfall was entirely self-inflicted. Just when Greg thought life couldn't possibly get any worse, it did. I had quietly stayed in touch with a few key people in Greg's old professional circle, people who owed me favors, who respected my business sense far more than Greg's overblown ego. It didn't take long for word to spread about Greg's spectacular fall from grace. But I wasn't finished. There was still one more move to make, a move that Greg never saw coming. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I made a major announcement on social media. The launch of my new investment firm, Mitchell Ventures, focused on real estate, luxury renovations, and startup capital for women entrepreneurs. I was no longer just Laura the interior designer. I was Laura the investor, the founder, the CEO. And guess whose old contacts started reaching out, eager to partner with me after seeing my rapid rise? Greg's former investors, his former colleagues, even the business circles that once orbited around him. I didn't have to lift a finger to poach his network. Greg's downfall did all the work for me. They wanted stability, success, and integrity. 3 things Greg had completely destroyed for himself. But the twist? That wasn't the real revenge. A few weeks later, I got a call from Jessica, my accountant. Apparently, Greg had defaulted on a few outstanding debts tied to a business venture we'd briefly shared before I cut him out. Due to legal oversights on his end, he was forced to liquidate some of his remaining personal assets to cover the losses. One of those assets was a small but high-potential commercial property Greg had secretly invested in, thinking it would be his comeback ticket. He'd never told me about it, never thought I'd find out. But thanks to Jessica's sharp eye, I did. It went up for auction. Quiet, low profile, fast. Guess who bought it? Me. At a fraction of its market value, I scooped up the property Greg had been banking on to rebuild his financial standing. And just for poetic symmetry, I turned it into the new headquarters for Mitchell Ventures. When Greg found out, it wasn't through lawyers or emails, it was in person. I was hosting an open house to celebrate the launch of our new HQ, and through mutual contacts, Greg caught wind of it. I wasn't planning to invite him, but fate has a cruel sense of humor. He showed up, uninvited, underdressed, and completely out of place. I spotted him lingering by the lobby entrance, staring up at the newly installed Mitchell Ventures logo gleaming across the atrium wall. His jaw slackened, eyes darting around as if trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before him. I approached him, poised and unapologetically confident. "Looks familiar?" I asked, feigning politeness. Greg swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. This was mine." I smiled, calm and unbothered. "Correction, it was yours. Now it's thriving under someone who actually knows how to build, not destroy." He stuttered, trying to piece together some pathetic excuse, but I didn't care to listen. I simply leaned in and delivered the final nail in his coffin. "You didn't just lose your house, your money, or your reputation, Greg. You lost your legacy, and I turned it into mine." The irony was almost too perfect. Greg's fresh start wasn't just stolen, it was transformed into a symbol of my victory. By the end of that night, Greg slipped away like a ghost, unnoticed by the crowd of successful investors, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders who now stood by my side. People who never would have given me a second glance while I was Mrs. Greg Mitchell, but now respected me as Laura Mitchell, self-made, unbreakable, unstoppable. Greg thought he was the one upgrading his life, but in the end, I upgraded mine. And I used his betrayal as the fuel. He walked out of my life with nothing, and I walked into a life with everything. For the first time in my adult life, I felt weightless. No more walking on eggshells, no more pretending, no more shrinking myself to feed a man's fragile ego. The months after launching Mitchell Ventures were the most liberating and transformative of my life. I traveled, not to escape, but to expand. I visited cities I'd only dreamed about, walked into boardrooms I was once too intimidated to enter, and sat across from investors who now saw me as an equal, or sometimes their superior. I no longer introduced myself as someone's wife. I was my own identity. Laura Mitchell, CEO, founder, investor, builder. My days were no longer spent cleaning up Greg's messes or pretending not to notice his lies. I spent mornings leading my team, afternoons mentoring young women entrepreneurs, and evenings building new projects. My money didn't just work for me, it grew for me. My network didn't drain me, it empowered me. People often asked, "How did you bounce back so fast?" I smiled, always knowing they were asking the wrong question. It wasn't about bouncing back. It was about evolving into someone Greg never imagined I could become. Somewhere along the way, I learned the most valuable lesson. The biggest revenge wasn't in destroying Greg. It was in refusing to let him define me. And then building a life so fulfilling, his existence became irrelevant. Greg's name barely crossed my mind anymore, except on the rare occasions when someone would send me a photo of him waiting tables part-time to cover rent or gossip about his failed attempt at starting over. I never responded, I never gloated, because by then, his downfall wasn't my victory anymore. My growth was. I bought a coastal property I always wanted, turned it into my private retreat. I adopted a rescue dog, something Greg always told me was too much responsibility. Turns out, unconditional love was exactly the kind of responsibility I welcomed. I reconnected with friends Greg had pushed away. I built deeper bonds with people who respected me for my strength, not for how well I could keep a household running. And most importantly, I learned to enjoy my own company. I no longer needed validation from anyone, especially not from a man like Greg. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset over the water, I thought about how far I'd come, how betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation became the very ingredients that birthed a new version of me, wiser, wealthier, freer. Would I change the past if I could? No, because every lie Greg told, every affair he had, every dollar he wasted, pushed me closer to the life I was always meant to live. That's the thing about pain. It either destroys you or it transforms you, and I chose transformation. My story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming power, rediscovering purpose, and rewriting my own ending. And I have to admit, the ending turned out far better than I ever imagined. If there's one thing my story taught me, it's this. Sometimes the worst betrayal isn't the end, it's the beginning. I used to think love meant sacrifice, that being a good partner meant tolerating flaws, forgiving mistakes, and holding a marriage together at all costs. I thought loyalty was the highest virtue, even if it came at the expense of my happiness. But Greg taught me something I'll never forget. Loyalty without respect is just self-destruction. He thought I was weak because I stayed quiet. He mistook my silence for submission, my kindness for naivety. What he never realized was, I was calculating, observing, preparing. And when I finally stood up for myself, I didn't just take back what was mine. I built something bigger, stronger, untouchable. I don't regret staying as long as I did. I don't regret giving Greg chances, because every moment I endured, every red flag I ignored, every tear I shed, taught me exactly who I never wanted to be again. I learned that the best revenge isn't screaming or begging for justice. It's thriving. It's walking away, head held high, knowing you outgrew the very person who tried to keep you small. To every woman listening, you are never stuck, you are never powerless, and you are never defined by someone else's betrayal. You define you. You rebuild. You rise. You reclaim. Because the truth is, sometimes the betrayal that breaks you becomes the breakthrough that builds you. And when that day comes, you won't just survive. You'll dominate.